Presidential Climate Commission has stressed that South Africa's energy transition is central to the country's economic transition. These sentiments were shared during an online discussion hosted by the University of the Free State earlier this week. For more on this, we are joined by Mr. Dipak Patel, Head of Climate Finance and Investment at the PCC Secretariat. Mr. Patel, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Now, achieving a just energy transition is central to the work of the Presidential Climate Commission, ensuring that the lives and communities that are tied to high-emitting energy industries are not left behind in the shift towards a low-emissions economy. Are we anywhere near achieving that objective?
Thank you, and good afternoon, Katlego, as well as to all your viewers at home. As the Presidential Climate Commission, we recently concluded our work with respect to a just transition framework for South Africa, and that framework was adopted by the Cabinet a few weeks ago as the overarching statement of strategy and principle as we undertake our journey towards what we call a lower carbon economy and a climate resilient society. What we need to understand is that in submitting what we call the nationally determined contributions to the UN system last year, we had done a fair amount of modeling work that showed that there are risks in not undertaking a climate response in view of the global trends that were emerging, but that secondly, if we were to undertake such a climate response transition, it would be absolutely imperative to make sure, and the President says this all the time, not to leave anyone behind. We know that South Africa has a history of being endowed with coal that powers our economy through the creation of electricity from burning that coal. We also know that almost our entire transport system is based on petroleum products, which themselves are high emitters of both CO2 and greenhouse gases. As we look at the world moving towards lower carbon outputs, we, in analyzing the industrial base of the country, realized that if we had to make this transition, we had to have a couple of very important principles that underlie this transition. Number one, the transition needed to be just. Number two, while we want to meet carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions outcomes, we also want to achieve socioeconomic development. And when we put these two things together, we as the PCC believe very strongly that an industrial transformation is required, which sees us moving away from coal as the primary energy source for electricity generation, the crowding in and rapid rollout of renewable energy sources for generation of power, as well as a movement towards electric vehicles as a very fundamental part of our industrial transformation program. I can deep dive into each one of these issues as we take the conversation forward, but in summary, you are absolutely correct to say that the Presidential Climate Commission believes that a just transition which sees quite a deep system change to our mining, agricultural, and industrial sectors needs to accompany our bid to decarbonize our system.
So, Mr. Patel, Minerals, Resources and Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe once told the National Energy Dialogue that South Africa needed an energy mix that includes renewables, gas, nuclear, coal, hydro and battery storage, as laid out in the 2019 Integrated Resources Plan. What are your views on this energy mix notion, specifically on the impact of jobs, given that coal is our second largest export by value?
So, Katlego, let me say that the IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan, is government policy as we speak this afternoon. However, Minister Mantashe has also indicated a very deep willingness to look at whether that IRP needs to be amended or updated, as the DMRE says. We believe as the PCC that that IRP needs to be updated and be much more directional towards renewable as well as greener sources of primary fuel. The one issue with respect to keeping coal, for example, in the IRP is that even our own domestic financiers have taken policy decisions not to invest going forward in coal. So, it's a moot point to say that coal has to be part of our future if there is no one who can finance that. And we know that the government balance sheet in terms of the fiscal constraints that it currently is experiencing also makes it very difficult. The second point to make is that the price for renewable generated electricity has come down very, very dramatically. And so any cost comparison, in our opinion, between coal in particular and renewables will render renewables probably more efficient. Finally, the point to be made with respect to other primary energy sources in the mix is that it's dependent on, one, meeting our climate ambitions in terms of decarbonization, but also, as you indicate, meeting our objectives with respect to economic growth, employment creation, as well as improving livelihoods. So let me take that bundle of things together and say that while in stable state operations, renewables on an ongoing basis might have fewer jobs associated with them than coal mining or coal-fired power station operations, what some of our early modeling has shown is that we need to be building capacity at a rate that is faster every year than what we've managed to build in the country over the last 10 to 12 years of our renewable energy program called the REAP 4. And in this context, you must remember that there are different types of job requirements. And one may make an argument, which I would like to make now, and that is if we have a sustained period of clear investment in renewable energy sources, just the multi-year contribution that construction drive would make as a contribution to employment would, in my opinion, surpass that of the jobs that are currently held in the mining sector. The counter-argument is that these jobs are temporary, but as I indicated, if we have a sustained drive over the next 20 to 30 years of building out renewable energy projects, then we have a sustained increase and continuation of jobs. The second point is that the environment has a very negative impact on communities who work either near coal mines and certainly workers who work in coal mines. The last point we want to make is that as the world goes towards a greener economy, we are also, as South Africa, blessed beyond coal and beyond the other mineral resources that we currently export. We are blessed with what we call the green minerals of the future. And therefore, if we find the right balance between the jobs that might be lost as a result of coal mining going into decline and a concomitant increase in the number of mining operations that begin to take advantage of our natural endowment in these green minerals, we believe that on balance we can create more jobs, better quality jobs, cleaner jobs, and less health damaging jobs if we get this transition right.
Now, Mr. Patel, African and global leaders in the oil and gas sector are going to converge in Cape Town this week for the Africa Oil Week. Considering that Africa's 55 countries account for only 3.8% of greenhouse gas emissions, what do you say to those that purport that the move to renewable energy overlooks the plight of Africa's people who are among the world's highest in terms of poverty, but emit the least of that pollution?
That's a very solid argument, and as the PCC, we believe that the issue of loss and damage, and that's precisely the point that you are making, needs to be considered by the developed world as they ask the developing world for their own economic pathways to be less carbon intensive. The point that you raise with respect to natural endowments of fossil fuels, whether that be oil and gas, or in our case coal, is a very relevant point. However, as the world moves towards cleaner sources of energy, the countries that believe that they can get benefit in global markets from exploiting their natural reserves need to be very careful. The care that needs to be exercised is that as the world moves away and demand for these fossil fuel primary energy sources declines, the kind of investments that countries in the rest of Africa have made and perhaps want to make run the danger and run, in fact, into a risk position of what we call stranded assets. So I think personally that Africa, endowed as it is with natural resources, needs, in terms of global market dynamics, to exploit those natural resources for as long as the global market holds up. And the risks associated with making the investments, as I said, is that those investments will not get the returns over time that is required. I must also say that countries which rely for their revenues on the export of fossil fuels, whether those be gas or oil, need to also look very, very carefully at what diversification strategies they undertake, both from a policy point of view as well as from the point of view of what their natural endowments allow them with respect to diversifying their economies, and begin to plan on a medium and long-term basis in line with those realities.
Mr. Patel, I am running out of time, but I just wanted to throw this in because I heard you mention earlier on the use of electric vehicles. We know that earlier this week Zimbabwe is revisiting their climate change policies and is seemingly leaning towards electric vehicles. I know you were also a DG in the Department of Transport once. What is your take on South Africa's prospect of moving towards electric vehicles?
So, Katlego, we believe that moving to electric vehicles is imperative for two reasons. Number one, the amount of carbon that we emit as a result of almost the entirety of our transport system being petroleum sourced means that we can find a better use, especially in public transport, but also in private transport, as the world itself shifts towards electric vehicles. The second reality is that we as South Africa have built a system of our inclusion in the global supply chain of vehicles. And so the largest of the, what we call OEMs, the public will know them by brand name, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, VW, Toyota, amongst them, have invested large amounts of capital to locate their manufacturing as well as assembly capacities in South Africa. The European Union have taken a decision that by 2035, or after 2035, they will ban the sales of new internal combustion engine vehicles. If we do not, both from a manufacturing point of view, as well as from a public transport, as well as private transport point of view, if we do not move towards electric vehicles, we will be struck by two issues. One is a deep loss of jobs as well as foreign exchange earnings that come from our motor vehicle manufacturing sector on the one hand, and secondly, we will not make good the commitments that we have pledged into the UNFCCC system with respect to our own domestic emissions.
All right. Thank you so much for your input and your insights on this very interesting. That's Mr. Dipak Patel, who is the head of climate finance and investment at the Presidential Climate Commission.